Well, welcome to week number 3 of our series from the book of Nehemiah. We're calling Politics Not As Usual. I want to welcome our Sapulpa campus, our Coweta campus, our online viewers. Glad to have you along with us. Would you turn in your Bible to Nehemiah chapter 2? If you've got something you can kind of follow along with us, that'll be our text. We'll actually be in chapters 2 and 4 and 6 as we continue this story, this saga from the story of Nehemiah's life about his holy ambition to restore the walls of Jerusalem. His ambition was to see God honored, God glorified. He had a holy passion, and his job involved rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And last week, we talked about the first part of this story, where part of his issue was he had to convince the king, King Artaxerxes, to be able to have permission that King Artaxerxes would overturn his previous decree and allow Nehemiah to go back and restart the rebuilding. And so he began by praying. We read about it in chapter 1. He also prayed in chapter 2, and then he's praying that God will persuade the king. We talked last week about God's sovereignty, that God can do whatever He pleases. God does as He pleases, when He pleases. And we talked about how knowing about God's sovereignty, that really encourages us to pray. It makes prayer an essential ingredient of doing anything that's going to accomplish His will. We also talked about how knowing that God is sovereign, it enables us to wait. We put our confidence in God, that God is accomplishing His purposes, and so we can wait on Him. We also talked about how knowing that God is sovereign, it is not a substitute for our planning and our preparation. Nehemiah, while he's praying, all along is coming up with a plan so that when God gives him the green light, he is ready to move ahead. We're going to talk today, though, about how often opposition comes along whenever we're doing anything great for God. In fact, if you want to write this main point down, this will be kind of the direction from which we'll go. A great ambition for God will always meet with great opposition. Nehemiah has something that he wants to accomplish. It is a great mission. It is a great thing that he's wanting to do. And Nehemiah is going to find early on that there is going to be great opposition that's going to come against it. And we know that the opposition, anything opposing God, is going to have God's enemy behind it. The enemy we know as Satan, the enemy of God. And Satan will do everything he can to frustrate and impede and prevent God's work. In fact, Satan does everything he can to impede the work of God by doing everything that he can to frustrate the people of God. He does everything he can to impede God's work, and he does it by doing everything he can to make the people of God frustrated. And he knows that if he can get God's people sidelined, if he knows he can frustrate them so much that they're discouraged and won't be involved, that they're not a threat to him. That's exactly what Nehemiah is going to face, the challenge that he's going to face. Now, you may be thinking, wait a minute, I thought this was God's will. I thought this is what God wanted to have happen, was that the walls would be rebuilt. Is this not God's will? Well, absolutely it is. But sometimes we think that if it's God's will, then everything is going along and it's going to be just fine, that God's going to make everything fall into place. It's going to be easy street. There's not going to be any problems. When you're doing the will of God, shouldn't life get easier? Well, by the fact that Nehemiah has opposition, it is just proof that this is God's will. In fact, we can't view the existence of opposition as God not in it, because when we read through the Bible, often God's will is going to be full of Satan opposing Him. A great ambition for God will always meet with great opposition. Now, God has moved, and King Artaxerxes has been persuaded to allow Nehemiah to go back and to begin rebuilding the walls, and has allocated resources to do that. All of that has taken place, and you would think that things are going to move ahead and move ahead at a great pace. Well, chapter 2, verse 10 tells us that Nehemiah runs into some immediate problems. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, They were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Now, this is, chapter 2, verse 10, the first mention that we have of any opposition to Nehemiah's great plan. But it's going to be something that is repeated throughout the story, throughout the book. And we need to ask ourselves the question, who are these guys that are greatly disturbed and going to cause problems? One of them is Sanballat the Horonite. Now, Sanballat was actually, we'll find out later, governor of Samaria. It was the region just north of Judah of where Jerusalem lay. And if you remember your history right, the Samaritans and the Jews, there was a lot of tension there, a lot of racial bigotry, a lot of hatred between them. And so we've got a little bit of an issue right there. So you've got Sanballat, who is to the north, and then just to the east is another issue that's going to take place, and that is Tobiah the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite. And so Tobiah also is going to cause a problem. The problems are from these two directions. One of them is simply a competitive edge. You've got people there that have loved Jerusalem not being effective, the area of Judah not being effective. And so there is a competitive thing. There is also a financial concern right here because trade routes used to run through Jerusalem, and it was an extensive place of trade. But since Jerusalem had been destroyed, though the trade routes still went through there, the trading actually took place in other places. Samaria and Ammon, you can guess. And so you've got these two governors of these two places who are against anything good happening in Jerusalem. And they come out, chapter 2, verse 10. Now, verse 11, we're not going to read through it, but Nehemiah begins to inspect the wall. He is in Jerusalem. He is inspecting and traveling through the area. He meets with some of the prominent Jewish leaders, and they see that God is in this. Remember, Nehemiah reminded them, God's hand has been upon me. And they rally together, and verse 18 says, so they began the good work. They're starting to rebuild the walls. Everybody's excited. And then here we step again, the same guys. Chapter 2, verse 19, read it with me. When Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and, this is interesting, Geshem the Arab is added onto it. When they heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you are doing? They asked. Are you rebelling against the king? Now, we've talked about Sanballat, we've talked about Tobiah, but who's Geshem? Geshem the Arab. And it's a third opponent that our friends Sanballat and Tobiah have found because they want somebody else to join along with them. In fact, that's exactly what critics do. They add to their numbers. They don't want to be by themselves. They want somebody else to come along and be with them. They want to expand their ranks. And so you'll experience that in life. Whenever you're doing anything for God, you're going to find that there will always be critics, and those critics will try to gather the support of other critics. Now notice, not only do they mock and not only do they ridicule us, but Nehemiah says they also ask this question, are you rebelling against the king? Now, this is a real threat to Nehemiah right there. The other thing is just kind of, words. But this is a real threat because it was 20 years ago that the Jews had persuaded King Artaxerxes to let them go back and begin some rebuilding. And they had done that. But the enemies there in Jerusalem, the enemies of the Jews had said, wait a minute. King Artaxerxes, if they rebuild those walls, they are going to revolt against you. They're going to rebuild their kingdom, and they're going to quit paying taxes to you. And King Artaxerxes, persuaded by them, issued a decree that demanded the stop of the rebuilding of the walls. And here Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem say, maybe we all ought to talk with the king about this matter. Let's talk with the king and remind him. It is an attempt to intimidate what Nehemiah and his people are going to do. You know this, that opposition always begins with verbal attacks. People mocking, people ridiculing, people suggesting things, starting rumors. Are you trying to rebel against the king? Adding on to the truth, those kinds of things. And Satan loves to use the verbal. In fact, I think that's why so many times the Bible warns us about our tongue and the use of our tongue and the danger of our mouth. Satan loves to use the verbal. Gossip, rumor, criticism, accusation, slanders, cheap shots. They all play in here. And what happens is verbal attacks always frustrate good people. In fact, verbal attacks are why good people get frustrated. It's how churches are destroyed. It's how congregations are divided. It's how families are divided. And the enemy most often frustrates holy ambition with verbal attacks. Most often starts with just verbal attacks. Now, listen to Nehemiah's response right here. He said, I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, His servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. Notice he starts by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. It's the same phrase that he used in his prayer, the God of heaven, his prayer in chapter 1. The God of heaven, the one who is sovereign, the one who is over all, the one that is in control of everything. He will give us success. How does Nehemiah handle this opposition? Would you write this first idea down? Nehemiah handles it by resting in the fact that God will accomplish His purpose. Nehemiah rests in the fact and in the promise that God will accomplish His purpose. Nehemiah says this is God's project and God can handle it. God can do it. He is God of heaven and earth. God can pull it off. And Nehemiah got to the point where he realized this is not me and this is not mine, and he relaxed in that fact. And in addition to that, Nehemiah went on in verse 20 to say, and you guys, you're not invested in Jerusalem. This is not your place and you have no right to it. You have no investment here. He was saying you have no investment in the things of God. And you know what I've learned about people that are do this same thing, verbally attack against the things of God, is that most often they have no spiritual investment in those things. They're not contributing, they're not participating, they're not involved in any pack. The most critical of people are those ones that are the least invested. They just want to complain and they just want to threaten. That's exactly what Nehemiah's finding in chapter 2. Now, I want you to skip over just a page or two and let's go to Nehemiah chapter 4, because we're going to see the same thing happening, except now the opposition is going to be intensified. In chapter 4, the walls are at the halfway mark. They're halfway completed. And so not only now have we had verbal intimidation, but now there is this move to threats of physical violence. No more is it just mocking and ridiculing. Now there are threats that are being slung around. How did Nehemiah respond to that? Chapter 4, verse 14. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, the rest of the people, with the threat of physical violence coming from those enemies, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. And then he goes on and says, you fight for your families, for your fathers, your mothers, your brothers, your sisters, your kids. Fight. Remember, though, the Lord your God. Remember He is great and awesome. In other words, Nehemiah is saying, make sure that you are focused on the right things. Don't focus on the opposition. Don't focus on how bad they think they are or how powerful they think they are. Don't focus on the wrong things. Focus on the great and awesome God. In fact, later on he'll say, our God will fight for us in verse 20. Remind yourself that the work belongs to the Lord. You cannot accomplish it in your own strength. Nehemiah reminding the people, this is not just about us. This is God's work, and He will accomplish it, the great and mighty God. Now, let's back up just a little bit. Go back to verse 7, just to give us a little context here. This is what's happening. When Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, you see the list getting longer, the men of Ashdod, when they heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's wall had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. In fact, can we see how this all plays together here? Because you'll notice that the opposition is continuing to increase. In fact, they're at the halfway mark. And you will notice that when you're doing anything for God, that the further you get along with it, the more intense the opposition is. Now, I know you know, because you've been watching TV like I have, what an electoral map is. Electoral map is ones that those that are running campaigns put up, and they show, is my candidate, is this particular state, is it leaning towards, or is it leaning away, or is it a toss-up state? You've seen these day after day, and they change back and forth. Let's look at Nehemiah's electoral map. This is where he finds himself right now. This is the area of Judah right here, and Jerusalem is right here. Here's the predicament now that Nehemiah is finding himself in. Let's go up to the state ahead, or to the north. This is Sanballat from Samaria. So he's got him to the north, totally leaning against him. He's got Tobiah the Ammonite from Ammon to the east, totally against him. He's got Geshub and the Arabs to the south, this area leaning totally against him. And now he has the men of Ashdod from the coast totally against him. You see what I'm getting at here is Nehemiah now surrounded by people that he would count as his opposition, people that are leaning away from Nehemiah. And verse 8 says, hey, we're coming after you. We've surrounded you, and we're coming after you. Now listen to this, verse 10. Let's go back, verse 10. Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. Now, the opposition has been saying, the enemy has been saying, we're not going to let you do this. But notice in this verse, who is saying we cannot rebuild it? It's not the enemies. It's not those surrounding the Jews. It's the Jews themselves that are saying this. They're saying, we'll never get it done. Nehemiah, this isn't going to happen. Nehemiah, we can't make it happen. It's too hard. It's costing too much. It requires too much sacrifice. And they're probably saying, well, who made this dumb decision anyway? Why in the world are we here? You know, we can handle a lot of criticism and a lot of opposition from people outside the ranks. But when it comes from within, when it's within the church, when it comes from within our family, when it comes from within our close circles, that's when it begins to hurt. That's when it becomes a real challenge. We can handle a lot from outside. We expect that. But Nehemiah now is faced with opposition that is not just from without, it is from within the ranks, and it is going to become extremely difficult. Go on to verse 11 of chapter 4. He says there, our enemies also said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them, and we'll kill them and put an end to the work. Then the Jews, again, who lived near them, came and told us 10 times over. They kept repeating it. Isn't that the way that this kind of opposition works? Wherever you turn, they will attack us. Nehemiah, whatever you do, wherever you turn, they're going to attack you. How does Nehemiah handle this? What does Nehemiah do? Listen to his response here. Verse 9, we prayed to our God. We posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Nehemiah says, we're going to pray about this. We're going to seek the sovereign God, the God of heaven and earth over this. But he also posted a guard. Go on just a few verses, and this is what they did. Verse 16, from that day on. Half my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officials posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand, held a weapon in the other. Each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. So they prayed, they kept rebuilding, but they also prepared themselves to fight. They worked with their hands, but they had their spear at their side. They did their work, but they had their sword on them. That's exactly what Nehemiah is doing. And would you write this next lesson? When faced with opposition, what does Nehemiah do? He takes appropriate action when necessary. Nehemiah takes appropriate action, and it is very much necessary, and it is radical action, a radical step, working with their weapons at their side. And it's a reminder to us, a lesson we talked about last week, that we have a responsibility to pray. But that prayer and that faith that we have in God does not excuse us, does not give us a license to just lay around and wait on God to act. Nehemiah is an example of that. He prays, but he takes the appropriate action, and they are prepared to do whatever is necessary. Now, I want you to skip to chapter 6. We're going to see this opposition continue to mount, but the wall here in this particular case, almost done. In fact, the text tells us that everything but hanging the gates and the doors is finally completed. They are getting close to finishing the task, and it is a good thing. Good things are happening, and they are moving ahead, and good things are happening. The wall is about to be done. It's almost completed, and the enemies of Nehemiah are saying, if we can't take care of this through discouragement, intimidation, then the only thing that's left is, let's kill Nehemiah. Let's just get rid of him. If we get rid of the leader, then no one else will step up. In fact, look at the story as it goes along. Chapter 6, verse 1. When word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, the rest of our enemies, that I had rebuilt the wall and not a gap was left in it except for the gates, then this is what they did. Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message. Hey, Nehemiah, come let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono. But they were scheming to harm me. We don't know how Nehemiah knew that. It probably wouldn't take much intuition to know they have been after him. But he gets this message. Nehemiah, why don't you join us out in one of the villages? Why don't you come out away from the city and let's have a conference? I'm a governor. Tobiah's a governor. Nehemiah, you're the governor of Judah. Come on out and let's have a conference together. We'll all get together and we'll work this thing out. You just enjoy a little bit of time away and let's talk. But Nehemiah all along knows that they are out to get him. Verse 3, so I sent a messenger to them with this reply. I'm carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you? 4 times they sent me the same message, and each time I gave the same answer. I can't be distracted with that. But then the 5th time, Sanballat sent his aide to me with the same message, and in his hand was an unsealed letter. So a 5th time, this messenger comes to Nehemiah and says, Nehemiah, we need to talk. Nehemiah, come on out and let's visit. Let's get you away from the city and let's have a conference and let's talk about how we're going to resolve this thing. But the 5th time after Nehemiah has said no, the 5th time this messenger comes with, it says, an unsealed letter in his hand. What's an unsealed letter? Well, a sealed letter meant that it was private. And no one would read it until it got to the final destination. But an unsealed letter meant that whoever had this until its final destination could read it. This is public information, public access. Anybody can read this thing. You would not put something in an unsealed letter unless you cared, unless maybe you wanted people to read it. What does it say in the letter? It was written, it's reported among the nations, and Geshem says it's true, everybody's saying it's true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you're rebuilding the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, all these people, you're about to become their king, and you have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There is a king in Judah. Now this report, Nehemiah, we'll get back to the king. So you better come and confer with us. You better come and talk things over with us. Nehemiah, word is spreading. Everybody knows what's going on here. Everybody's talking about it. You better come talk it over with us. And a 5th time, Nehemiah says, no. How was it he was able to do that? Would you write down, Nehemiah possessed a focused understanding of his God-given task. Nehemiah knew what he was about. He knew he was about a great project. And that's why he could continue to say, I am not going to come down and mess with you guys who are trying to cause a distraction and divert things. I am carrying on a great a project and cannot come down. You know, it is easier to say no when you know you're on a mission from God. It's easier to say no to those that are trying to divert your attention when you recognize that you are accomplishing something for God, that you are a part of God's project, that you are a part of His purpose, that you're on a mission from God. The apostles did it in Acts chapter 6. You remember the story? They're building the church in Jerusalem. And it comes to their attention, though, that there are some widows that are being neglected. They're not getting the daily distribution of food. And the temptation for them, people were saying, hey, you guys have to fix this. We need you to come over and do this. Hey, Peter, hey, James, John, come down and take care of this. And they said, no, we're doing a great project. And they appointed qualified men to take care of this situation so that they would not be distracted, so that they could give their attention as apostles to the ministry of the Word and to prayer. That's what Nehemiah is doing right here. He's saying, I have something more important to do. And so if they can't get them to stop through their verbal attacks and intimidation and their threats, and if they can't get Nehemiah away to kill him, they decide they'll destroy his reputation. And they solicit the help of someone that he knows, someone that's close to Nehemiah, somebody that knows him and can seduce him in just a little bit. Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 10 says, one day I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabel, who was shut up in his house. We don't know why. Was he a shut-in? Was he in a way where he could not get out? Maybe he was just one of those people that didn't get out of the home. We don't know. He said, let us meet in the house of God, inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors. Here's why, Nehemiah. Because men are coming to kill you at night. Nehemiah, they are going to come and kill you. This is an acquaintance. This is somebody that Nehemiah knows. This is also a person that'll do anything for money. And he is out to betray Nehemiah. And he tells Nehemiah, they're going to kill you, and the only place for you to hide is in the temple. Now, we know he's a prophet. He probably, because of that, is a priest as well. He would have access to the temple. Let me hide you in the temple, Nehemiah. Go on to verse 11. But I said, should a man like me run away? God's given me something to do. Should I not be a man of courage? I'm not going to run away. Or should one like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go. I realized that God had not sent him, but that he prophesied against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. They'd given him money to do this. He had been hired to intimidate me so that I would commit a sin by doing this. And then that would give me a bad name to discredit me. What they were doing now is out to discredit, out to defame, out to ruin Nehemiah's reputation. So what's the sin? The sin that he would commit by doing this? Well, the sin was that it was not lawful for anyone but a priest to enter into the proper temple. The consequence was death. And so if Nehemiah, thinking that people were out to kill him, took refuge in the temple where he was not allowed to go, then people would eventually hear about this. And when people heard about this, his reputation, he would not be the leader. He would not be the leader that God has called him to be. So how does Nehemiah handle this? Look at what he says, verse 14. Remember Tobiah, Sanballat, oh my God? He's praying. Because of what they've done, remember also the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who have been trying to intimidate me. Look what Nehemiah's doing. He's turning it back to God. You see, when we're criticized, when we're attacked, when we're questioned, when people come after us, our natural tendency is to strike back, is to get even, is to defend ourselves and to pay them back. Not Nehemiah. Nehemiah turns it over to God. In fact, what did Nehemiah do? Would you write this last thing down? Nehemiah turns his enemies over to the justice of the ultimate judge. Nehemiah says, I'm not going to get involved in these games. I'm going to immediately turn this matter over to God. God, deal with them. God, would you judge them? God, would you bring justice to this situation? In fact, you go back to chapter 4, listen to Nehemiah's prayer. Hear us, O God, for we are despised. And then listen to the tone of this prayer. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they've thrown insults in the face of the builders. That doesn't sound like a godly person, does it? He's saying, God, sick them. God, you take care of them. God, take care of our enemies. In fact, it sounds an awful lot like the way David prayed in the Psalms. God, silence my enemies. Scatter my enemies. Take care of my enemies. God, would you trample them down? Would you strike them down? Nehemiah here, instead of trying to even the score, got God to deal with it. See, Nehemiah had a zeal for the glory of God. That's what he was about. That's the real thing behind rebuilding the walls. It was all about the glory of God. And what the enemies of Nehemiah found out is that when you oppose God's people who are doing God's work, you oppose God Himself. When you oppose God's people who are doing God's work, you oppose God Himself. And as we'll see through the rest of the story, the project prevails, the walls get finished, Jerusalem is rebuilt. But a great ambition for God will always meet with great opposition. It's true of Jesus, isn't it? I mean, really, Nehemiah's story is one from the Old Testament that points us to the person of Jesus. Jesus, all about the glory of God, had a zeal for the glory of God, on mission to accomplish something for the glory of God. But even the Son of God, in His zeal for God's glory, met with opposition. King Herod tried to kill Him as a baby. Satan tempted Him early in His ministry. His brothers tried to discredit His early ministry. Jewish leaders questioned His authority. Peter disowned Him. Judas betrayed Him. Roman soldiers crucified Him. Death even took Him captive, but only for a time, because the will of a sovereign God cannot be thwarted. God does what He pleases, even amidst opposition. And in your life, that's true. God does as He pleases. And God, when you're trying to accomplish something for Him, you will notice the opposition comes. Rest in the fact God's at work. Cannot be thwarted. Take appropriate action when necessary. Stay focused on the task. And ultimately, you let Him do what He does best. And that's to deal with the justice and the judgment. Father, we thank You for reminding us of Your story through the man of Nehemiah. God, thank You that You remind us that when we do things for You, we can expect to be attacked, we can expect threats, we can expect to be opposed. And God, I pray that in those times, we will remember that You are sovereign and in control. God, help us to rest in that fact, to find strength in that fact. God, help us to trust You during those times. Help us to do the things that are necessary. God, help us to plan, to prepare, to do the work, sometimes even to fight when necessary. But God, help us to recognize that ultimately You are our judge. And we give those that are against You and against us over to You to deal with. Help us in Jesus' name. Amen.